What's going on, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Learning from the Pros. Joining me today, sharing her top 10 tips on working with paid ads, agencies, freelancers, and consultants is Brittany Blanken. She is a demand generation consultant working with B2B SaaS companies. She is also an instructor at AdConversion, teaching our B2B Advertising Foundations course launching later this year. So Brittany, welcome. Super glad to have you here.
What's up? I'm pumped. Thanks for having me. Let's go.
I'm super stoked. You already knew it was like an instant DM for me when we came up with this segment on learning from the pros. And like, we got to get Brittany on here to share her tips. You know, the hardest part about getting Brittany on here was thinking about like what for her to cover, because there's so many things you could share 10 tips on. So we thought we would take a much more unique and uncommon topic, which is working with paid ads, agencies, freelancers, and consultants. Brittany, what's been your experience in terms of like your exposure to working with these third-party contractors?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been on the in-house side for over 10 years. And so I was like really as a demand gen manager, director, and like working my way up to a VP, I've always needed to extend my team, whether it's agencies, consultants, freelancers. So I've actually been on both sides now, and it's been fascinating to understand like, wow, if I actually knew the things I know now, like coming from like the consultant side, I would have probably managed a lot of my agencies and freelancers and consultants a lot differently as an in-house marketer. So I'm really excited, but that's like really where I come into play. So really, if you are an in-house marketer, I've really designed these things for you. And of course, like if you're a freelancer or consultant, take these two and run with it, because it's really how can you create a high performance team to not only help your clients better, but then also how can you get what you need to drive more results even faster.
Yeah, I'm definitely taking my notes here for the agency side for sure. Let's kick off with tip number 1.
So really, when it comes to these tips, there's 10 tips, right? And I was like, geez, I could write 100 tips, to be quite honest. So I bucket them into 4 buckets of tips. So you got people, you've got product, you got process, and then you've got results. And I really made sure to highlight within the tips, like how they resonated with each of those buckets. So the first bucket is all around people, right? So this is around defining working expectations and who's really involved. Because if you're not really setting those expectations up front of like how you're working with your clients or vice versa, things get weird real fast. And then same thing, if you don't know your internal teams or who's going to be working alongside you, your client might get confused too. So really understanding the people involved in creating your process is going to be super key. So that's where I started. So let's dive in. The first one around people is right. Number 1, be clear on your communication needs and expectations up front. So this is really deciding, if you're working in Slack versus email, how quickly you want your responses to come in too. So, hey, if I'm hiring an agency, I want to be very clear, like, hey, I want you to answer my Slacks or my emails within 12 business hours or within 24 business hours. What does that look like? Because that's really going to help the expectations up front of how quickly you guys are going to be moving and what those expectations are around.
My default is it's implied, it's obvious, like as soon as possible is kind of my, just how I operate. But that's such a good point. That's already a nugget for me, because I'm not asking clients how fast do you want us to respond to you? Like my assumption is we're going to respond to you as fast as humanly possible. But maybe that's an opportunity where, like, if you're listening to this as like an agency or someone on the service side, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot with a false expectation, right? And you have more wiggle room than you might think in terms of what this client needs from a communication standpoint.
100%, hands down. Because then, like, if you're managing multiple clients, which a lot of us are, right? It really helps you prioritize, how do I need to get back to these clients, and really triage your day more effectively. Tip number 2. So again, this is all about people. The second tip is, decide your meeting cadence, right? How frequently do you want to have meetings with these clients? Again, it goes back to the communication, but some clients want to meet weekly. Some clients want to meet bi-weekly, right? It just really depends. So again, understanding their needs, how fast they want to get things done is going to really help you hold accountability. So for instance, for me, when I'm onboarding a client, I like to have as like one meeting a week for the first 6 weeks so that we can start gaining the momentum faster. And then once we're in a steady state, then we can back off to biweekly. Again, it just depends on the goals, how quickly they need to get there, what do the timelines look like. So the meeting cadence is so key because it's really a forcing function. It helps like not only the agencies and freelancers like get their shit together, but also it helps make sure that are you getting what you need fast enough from your client, and then vice versa.
Weekly for the first 6 weeks, and then from there shift towards a biweekly cadence. When you were in-house, did you find this cadence was like what worked best for you as the point of contact?
I think so. Yeah. And again, like especially when it comes to paid ads, those first 6 weeks of getting everybody set up, getting them into systems, aligning goals, getting them to understand my ICP and audience, like having 2 weeks in between, it's just like nails on the chalkboard for me. Like, let's address everything pretty quickly. So yeah, in-house, I really like that. And a lot of agencies, depending on how much we were dealing with, it continued to be weekly for a much more extended time. So again, I think it just depends on what do your clients need? What are the goals? Are you hitting those goals or exceeding them? And then really kind of maneuver there. But for me, I found at least 6 weeks is really key for the first for like weeklies, and then figure it out from there.
This is an unplanned question, but do you have any insights, like things that have worked for you in terms of structuring the meetings when you are with your client on that weekly or biweekly, whatever it ends up being?
Yes. I actually just wrote a LinkedIn post about this, dude. Like, yes,
all right,
yes,
let's
yes.
go.
So the first thing you want to do when you're structuring your meetings is really understand like who's going to be on that meeting. So a lot of my meetings are dealing with VPs of marketing, CROs, CEOs. They don't want to get into the weeds unless they have to, right? So I really structure my meetings on kind of an executive communication level. And I break it down into 3 major buckets. Notable updates. What do you need? Like, what do you need to know? What you need to give a shit about? Number 2, here are all the roadblocks that are preventing me to hit our goals faster. And then number 3, priorities and action items. Here's what's in progress. Here's what we're working on. Here's what I need from you. These are the action items set. And I really break it down to those 3 buckets. And it really helps. And especially going back to those notable updates, when you are clearly defining your goals, make sure that you are reporting on those goals. How are we pacing to lead volume, pipeline volume, conversion rates? And then make sure that they know, okay, yep, we launched this campaign to address X. We adjusted this copy to address Y. So again, that's what, when it goes to, when you're talking about notable updates, make sure you're also including the goals.
I love that. So just to recap that, first, you got to know who you're speaking with. And then in terms of the way you think about the actual running the call, it's you break them into these 3 buckets. So you've got notable updates, what you need to know, and then blockers. I think oftentimes when you're on the service side, it's really easy to bombard the client with information that's too in the weeds. I mean, I know I'm guilty of this, and you know, we've definitely experienced this on the agency side where it's like we are getting too into the minutia, and it's like, are we wasting our effort here? And then the other downside too from the service side is you're putting all this time and energy to craft this update and have all this level of detail, but the reality is maybe they don't even care, you know what I mean? And they don't want to know that.
And that is such like a huge thing that I still struggle with. Like, am I getting too detailed, or am I providing too much of an update? Because at the end of the day, I think like your meeting should be a proactive and productive conversation, not like, hey, here's a screen or a slideshow with bullets and let me walk through. Because like, why are you having the meeting? That could have easily been a Loom update or a Slack update. So it should, like, your meeting should be around, of course, getting them like up to speed on what's happened, but really taking that opportunity to have those strategic conversations to make sure, are we prioritizing things correctly? Are there things that aren't performing well? How do we need to pivot? I think if you can have a productive conversation, that's the lens that I always look through. Because I think, again, that's how the meeting should that's how I would want the meetings to roll.
I love that. Just one tip for everyone listening on the communication side. What I've found is that the better job you do communicating asynchronously, the more trust you'll build with the client and the less of a need they'll feel to have those weeklies and then be able to switch to bi-weekly, what you're saying. And one really tactical thing that we found works really well is every Monday, start off the week with an alignment message in the Slack channel. Like, hey, everyone, hope you had a great weekend. here are our current priorities for the week, things we're working through. It just gets everyone on the same page. They understand what matters, if there's any pending items on their side. And then on Fridays, you send a recap message like, hey, everyone, happy Friday. We won the week. Here's the key things that we accomplished. Here's some things to be mindful of. Hope you have a great weekend. And just adding that Monday alignment message and that Friday recap dramatically reduces the need for that weekly sync. So then when you do get together, to your point, like I like emphasize this in my notes, that keyword productive, you can actually have a productive meeting where everyone's aligned and they're on the same page. And the meeting is less about like, what are we working on? What are we doing? And like all the little details and like catch up. And it's more of like, hey, we're here to understand how we're pacing a goal and what are the big blockers and things to be mindful of, like you said earlier.
100%. That's huge. I started incorporating that into my communications with my clients. And it's you hit the nail on the head, Silvio. It really, really does help, especially with building trust, especially early on. And even from your client side, I actually hated when I didn't hear any updates from my agency partners or my freelancers and consultants. It was like crickets. And like, we know that we're working on the account and we're doing stuff almost every day, but they don't know that, right? They can't read our minds. They don't know what's going on. So even saying, hey, this is what we did, like just the quick little, you're still on our mind. You're not like,
yeah, serious.
Like it's such a big thing because I know so many marketers, me included, we've been burned by so many agencies. Like the first 6 weeks are great. And then what? And then it's like the communication just drops off. So if you start a consistent communication outreach strategy at the beginning, it's easier to hold on to that, but it's also easier to continue that. It's almost like getting them in the habit of like, oh yeah, I'm going to hear from them on Mondays and Fridays. I don't want to and it prevents that ad hoc communication, which could also derail your productivity. So 10 out of 10, I would totally recommend.
One of the best compliments I ever got was from a client, and this is like 13 months into working together. And they're like, Silvio, I just want to let you know, like working with you on month 13 still feels like it's month 1. Like in the terms of like, we're always communicating, we're active, we're doing things. And by just setting up those rituals and simple habits and routines, it forces that consistency, where you're like, hey, it's just what we do. Like going to the gym, it's like, it's Monday, I'm hitting chest. You know what I mean? Like there's no thought, and it's just that ritual. And the same thing from the communication cadence with clients. Yeah, I love it.
Tip number 3. So this is the last one in the people bucket. This is all around being really clear of who and what tools your agency or freelancers will need to be working in, and who are they working with adjacently on the team. So for instance, systems are super, super key, especially when it comes to working with people. So understanding, who everyone that you're interfacing with is going to really help streamline operations and getting things done. And then also making sure that, giving your agency or freelancers as much access as they need up front will help expedite everything. I mean, when I onboard a new client, I have a list of the tools that I'll need access to when it comes to managing paid ads or managing demand gen strategy, right? So it's like, give me Slack or Teams access, give me access to all the ad platforms, marketing automation, CRM access, website access. The list goes on and on. But if you can provide a list and even how the client can get those to you faster with instructions, links, the easier it's going to be.
I cannot echo that point enough. Loom videos here are critical. Like you can film Loom showing you how to provide access to HubSpot or link an article. Just dovetailing on that point of like getting clear on who and what tools. If you're listening to this and you are working internally, right, and you're working with an agency or a third-party vendor, if you can get clear on the tools that you need to give them access to, and then figure out like who's responsible on your team to get them access, just going through that thought process can already help you accelerate the onboarding time of that agency and freelancer consultant. Because at the end of the day, if they're not able to get access to their tools, they're not going to ramp up fast enough. So you're going to be spending money and time on somebody that's not 100% full capacity and just running.
I mean, I go as far as I have a client questionnaire that I ask a lot of like strategic questions on, but then I even ask like, what are the tools that are in your tech stack? And once I know that, I will literally rinse and repeat, yep, this is the tools, here's what I need access to. And so they're already starting to think about it. And so I've expedited my onboarding process significantly by asking those specific questions, because a lot of times when I was an in-house marketer, it would take agencies on average 4 weeks just to get in my systems. And it's just like, I don't have
It's
enough
crazy.
time. And so
Yeah.
knowing that was a huge pain point of mine, I was like, no, how can I get into your tools and start providing value ASAP? That was a game changer. So now asking those right questions, getting access, giving them instructions, I'm in their systems day one pretty much. And I'm literally speaking from experience. I just onboarded a new client 2 weeks ago. We made sure to audit everything, get going, and we launched our first campaign legitimately in the first 5 days of getting going. Obviously, ad conversion is very different. You guys are a different breed over there. You're not going to find that, period, if you're on a major agency perspective, but you're definitely not going to find that with an agency if you're not prepared with coming to the table with giving them access right away. So tip number 4, this is where we're going to swing into like the product bucket. So this is really where tip number 4, if you are working with an agency, freelancer, consultant, review your brand foundation with them. This is going to be super crucial. And what I mean about brand foundation, it's like really covering, what does your company or solution do? What is it? What is your unique value proposition? Why are you different? What's your key messaging? Like your origin story, your value statements, your tone of voice, your competition. Like this is where you're going to really take them through what your product or solution is so that they can actually come alongside you and be a productive extension of your team, and even go as far as scheduling time with your agency or freelancers to sit on a demo so they can really live and breathe in your product. That's been huge. So going back to this onboarding questionnaire that I've put together, like if you don't do that, I definitely recommend it, but start asking these questions so that your clients or your decision makers can easily answer those, because that's a huge portion of kicking things off correctly.
On the flip side of that, if your agency, consultant, freelancer, whatever they might be, is not asking you to explain to them these things around your unique selling proposition, what's your messaging look like, who are the competitors you're going against, what are the key aha moments people get from your product, how does your product work? Like, I always say at the end of the day, as a marketer, you need to sell yourself first, because how are you going to sell others? So if they're not trying to understand your business and your product and your end persona, how effective will they be at like brainstorming cool creative ideas, coming up with targeting possibilities, writing copy, crafting offers? They're not, because they don't really understand who's on the other side of the message.
Bingo. That is going to be so crucial for you to get so much out of your relationship.
I always say like marketers, we're really good thieves, because at the end of the day, all we're doing is we're trying to tap into our customer and just steal all the genius from them and just repurpose it and get it back from them, right? Like your target customer knows the messaging, they know the pain points, they know the key outcomes that they care about. And it's like, all we are here to do is tap into their genius as much as possible, steal as much as we can, reshape it, reformat it, present it in a better way, and then just speak to them with what they care about.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if you don't know your audience, your customers, what the heck are you doing? Like, come on, that's where you start. Yeah. So yeah, in that, reviewing the brand foundation, make sure you're asking who your customers are. Send me a list of logos, and so I can like creep on them on LinkedIn, like do it.
Yeah. One thing I'll add on tip 4 here around your brand foundation. If you're listening to this and you're like, I'm thinking about working with an agency, freelancer, consultant, etc., but I don't really have a strong brand foundation. I don't have messaging documents in place. I haven't clearly defined our top competitors. Like, you haven't done the product marketing work first. From a paid ads perspective, I would almost caution you to really dial that in and get that clear first, because with paid specifically, it's just an accelerant, right? And it's like guaranteed distribution and guaranteed visibility. But if you haven't figured that out, it's like those are the elements. Almost think of it as like the Lego blocks that go into creating the actual set. And if you don't have that figured out, your ad agency might not be able to support you in the best way because a lot of your budget is going to go being spent on trying to figure that stuff out versus you coming to the table with those insights already.
So number 5, so we're still in product world. Make sure your extended team fully knows the audiences you're targeting. We kind of tapped into that in tip number 4, but literally, like, I wanted to emphasize it in its own tip because audience is the foundation of everything you're going to be doing. So really dive into who you're targeting. So what's the ICP, verticals, industry, job titles, functions, like really, really hone in on that and make sure that they know that, where your buyer personas and their pain points and their jobs to be done. Like, find legit examples of customer testimonials and validate that. Send them recorded calls from like prospecting calls that went really well. Get as close to their customer as possible and vice versa. Give your agency or your freelancers, your consultants as much customer information as possible because they need to know that.
And have a shared place where this information lives. So if your ad agency is going to build campaigns for you, they don't have to constantly keep hitting you up on, hey, what were the job titles for this persona that we want to go after, or the industries? Like, just have a shared living document where all that stuff lives. And then what I would recommend that you ask of your ad agency or freelancer consultant, whoever's running your campaigns, is to take your messaging documents and, you know, all that information you already have, and then have them translate your buyer's persona into the ad persona. So essentially what that means tactically is, you know, when you have these beautiful product marketing docs, it's like you have these certain titles, you have these industries and things like that, which is fantastic. But it's like what you have and then what LinkedIn actually allows you to target is sometimes, you know, it's always different, essentially. By taking it a step further and then having them transfer your buyer persona to an ad persona, it's essentially just translating what are the actual targeting options that are available to get in front of that buyer's persona, right? So it's very specific to the platform. So most of you listening to this, if you're in B2B, you're going to be on LinkedIn. So we can actually link in the show notes here an ad persona document that we have in our Building a Paid Media Program course. And you guys can just copy that, make it as a template. But essentially, it's broken out into different sections of like, what are the firmographics? What are the demographics? What is the consumption? What types of keywords will they search that can inspire Google ads and paid search activities? But just having them do that, I think will be really great, because oftentimes in my experience, you could have these illustrious product marketing documents, but then when it's like showtime and like we're gonna actually get in front of this person, maybe the title is so niche that you can't actually get to them by targeting through title, and you need to get creative and maybe use like function seniority skills or something else.
And I would honestly take it one step further too and have your clients define what is like a good lead look like, and what is like a good, like, what is a lead versus an MQL, or a lead versus a qualified lead, so that when you're starting to review the leads that are coming in from your campaigns, you guys are very aligned on all of those criteria. So you're like, well, yeah, they raised their hand to request a demo, for instance, but they're actually not qualified because they have the wrong job title, right? So that then you can then go proactively look and like start excluding those and suppressing them from your targeting. So again, like, take it a step further too, like build out that ad persona, but then also build out like, what's a qualified ad persona look like too, so that you're constantly staying in alignment with your client. And then vice versa, like in-house marketers, really guide your agencies to what happens after those leads come in. Like agencies, a lot of times they just stop. Yep, we generated leads, done. That's not how I operate. I know that's not how AdConversion operates, but it's like, you've got to enable them to get deeper, because it's not about generating leads. It's about generating legit pipeline revenue for the business. So make sure to have a clear understanding of what does that look like and what does that process look like.
One more super practical tip. I mean, if you guys haven't got value already, I mean, have you been listening? But one more extremely practical tip on tip 5, that it's something that we do, and it's like so easy to do, and you can do it if you're in-house and set this up for your agency, or if you're lucky and you have a great consultant like Brittany, or you're working with an ad agency like us and they can set up for you. Have a shared channel with lead alerts, and make sure everyone is in that channel of the lead alerts, so then they can see the name, the title, the company, and even better, if it's from LinkedIn, capture the LinkedIn profile URL. So then you can click on the LinkedIn profile URL and actually see who opted in. And it's such a masterclass in terms of quality and have everyone on the same page.
Literally game changer. Yes. Double click on that. Seriously. And then you can talk about it in real time with your clients. It's amazing. Tip number 6. So this is a really good transition. We're transitioning into like the process tips now. So I kind of hinted at it in my last tip, but for this one, be specific on how things should be tracked. Like define your operational plumbing, because again, we're not here to just drive leads. We're here to drive legit impact for the business. So understand and work with your teams, whether you're in-house, agency, consultant, to map out, okay, when someone converts and fills out a lead gen form, now what? What do qualified leads look like? How are leads being handed off to the sales team? Do we have BDRs that are following up? How are they being alerted, right? What does that look like? What does that process look like? And walk through that. And then number 2, like understand the tracking of it. So do we need to use specific UTMs on our campaigns? Do we need to include our lead gen forms on specific workflows in our marketing automation platform to make sure that they are routed correctly, right? So walk through those things and define it, because things that matter get tracked. And if you can't track it, what the heck are you doing?
Tracking all of the steps is so vital, like pre, post, because at the end of the day, it's going to give you signals, right? And then depending on your sales cycle, your product, your segment, et cetera, it will take longer. So like, let's assume the goal is to drive an op. Depending on you and your business, it could take a while to get an actual op. So if you have to wait 3 months, 6 months to know if you actually are going to get an op or not, like most people can't afford that. We can't even spend 2 weeks on a campaign without any like guiding light on how it's performing. So mapping out those different steps to be tracked is critical. If you can do that work internally already for your agency and say, hey, here are my life cycle stages. We want to understand how we are progressing through them. We want to understand the drop off, the conversion rates. That will give your partner so much clarity on how you're judging success and ultimately how they should be reflecting. And then going back to our earlier point, how they should be reporting to you on the things that you need to know on your syncs.
I mean, I think we just jumped into my next tip. Like make sure. So the next tip number 7, is really understanding your historical benchmark so that you can share it with your agencies and freelancers. Again, like map out your funnel, but understand like this is how we're operating now. So leads are converting into qualified leads at 80% conversion rate. Okay, cool. How can we maintain that or even increase that? That's going to be those guardrails that your partners are going to be needing to operate efficiently.
If people aren't asking you questions like, what's your historical benchmark, right? Like, what is the average pipe to spend you've been receiving from these channels? What's your pipe to spend target on average? How many qualified leads turn into an actual meeting and so on and so forth? Probably a red flag that they are not trying to drive the actual business impact.
100%. I'm going to like double into that too. Like if they aren't even asking you like your cost per opportunity, your cost per lead, your win rates, they aren't reverse engineering your funnel to make it as efficient as possible, because there's break-even CPLs. Like there's things that you can do to guide your client in a way that makes sense for their funnel, because everyone has different unit economics. So really understanding those to then reverse engineer what's actually should be working is going to be a game changer, or you're just going to be flying blind. They're going to be flying blind. So it's just, if they're not asking you those questions, huge red flag.
I'll give you a real example. We have a client where their initial goal that they told us was to maximize as many leads as possible. Just like, he's like, let's just drive the most leads. And we basically like unpacked that a little bit. We're like, yeah, of course we want to drive the most leads, but even if you're not 100% sure, it's totally fine. This can be changed in the future, but give us a specific target, one key specific target where it's, if we achieve this one thing, everything else is fantastic. We are successful. For most businesses, that something has to do with pipeline or revenue impact. So like if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I'm running awareness campaigns. So, we want to drive awareness, like expose accounts, we're measuring video view completions and all that's fantastic. And like all that stuff matters. And yes, you should be optimizing and watching it. But at the end of the day, what's the one core goal, the one key KPI where it's like, this is the thing that we use as the filter to then run all of our other decisions, opportunities through. Because if you don't have that one goal, then you're not going to have the clarity of mind on like, hey, we should prioritize these types of channels, or we should prioritize these types of, campaign objectives, and so on and so forth. And then adding on to that, assigning a timeline. Hey, we want to achieve a 5x pipe to send ratio from paid, in the next 90 days. Like, that is just gold. So then from there, now your agency can be more effective at saying, hey, here's how we're pacing towards that target. So even if it'll change, it's better to have something to aim for than nothing at all.
Tip number 8. So this is a very tactical process tip, but be clear on your naming conventions if you have a preference. This goes for if you're telling that to your agency or freelancer consultant, or vice versa, because at the end of the day, I want my clients to be able to jump into these ad platforms to understand what's working, what's not in real time, like really empower them to do so. If you don't have legit, consistent naming conventions, it's going to look like Chinese to them. They're not going to understand it. And it's not going to be congruent with any of the reporting that they may have too. So just lean in there and understanding like what your teams want to name campaigns, forms, creatives, define that in the onboarding, because that's going to affect how you organize the account, how your client's going to be reporting. And it's going to help you enable your client to maybe get in there if they want to like kind of read everything correctly.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this on the client or on the internal side and you're like, I don't really know what naming conventions I should set up, I'm not 100% sure, just ask yourself, what are the kind of questions I'd like to answer from these campaigns that I'm running? And then just work backwards. So for example, if you'd like to answer a common question like, what ad message is working best? Well, then you should know already in your ad name, in your naming convention, you should have something around the angle that you're testing within the ad, because then it's going to make it easy to report. Or maybe the question you want to ask is, how is the US doing against EMEA, right? A certain region. Then by default, I should probably have the region in my campaign name, because that's a question I want to answer. I think a lot of times people, they get caught up in like, oh, well, how are other people doing their naming conventions, or what conversion tracking setup? Like, I had a question the other day, somebody's like, what event should I track in GA4? And I'm like, you're starting from the wrong place. Like, it starts with, what are the questions that I want to answer? And then make sure you have the naming conventions set up that allow you to easily answer it. And then the same thing from a tracking perspective.
Tip number 9. So this is the last bucket that I organize all the tips in. And this is really the results bucket. Have clear, trackable goals. Okay? Like determine the metrics that matter, that your partners should track, and the frequency they should report on these metrics. I like to report on these weekly, just to make sure everything is working correctly. Pacing makes sense. We're pivoting quickly, right? And also ensure that you understand those leading and lagging indicators. If you're listening to this and you're the in-house point of contact, come to the table with those goals. Be very clear. Hey, these are the expectations. These are what I want. This is the goals that I want to see, the metrics that I want to exceed. If you're in that experimental phase of, well, I don't know what it should be. Well, let's start somewhere together. If you have clear, consistent goals and just objectives that you want to reach or exceed, that's going to help you prioritize what needs to be done first.
So what's your approach when clients tell you certain goals and like you yourself don't know if it's realistic or not? So maybe your client's like, oh, I want to drive 100 ops in a month or something like this. Yeah. How do you think about it and like approach that?
I think it just goes back to tip number 5 or 6 that we talked about, like understanding the process. Like, what are their benchmarks? What are their win rates? What is their deal size? And like really understand that, because again, if they're like, yeah, we want to drive X amount of pipeline in 2 months, but the speed to generate an opportunity is 90 days, 3 months, well, then that doesn't make sense. So it's like, let's see if it is realistic based off like your historicals and what your go-to-market unit economics looks like. And then if you're coming to the table with those goals and they make sense, then let's freaking go. But if it doesn't, then that opens up a really good conversation of, hey, let's actually talk through this together. This is what makes sense. Like, this is realistic. And sometimes they need that. Sometimes I'm working with a ton of clients right now that don't really understand how to get there, and so that's why they're hiring us. So make sure like
Yep.
you're coming in as a partner who is confident to push back in obviously a respectful way, but you're there to help them achieve that. Let's make sure it makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And if you're listening to this right now and you're like, I don't have historical benchmarks, I don't have anything to go off of. I'm just starting from zero. Then what you want to do instead is you want to have that target, but then think of it as like malleable, right? Because you don't have anything to support it. And then as far as like your ad campaigns go, you want to be thinking in terms of pilots. Hey, let's launch a pilot on this channel, get some benchmarks, have some baselines. Okay, now we can start to get a little bit more strategic and calculated of what can we expect, what can't we expect, and so on and so forth. For people listening to this and they're like, well, how much is enough to get started? I always recommend at least 100 clicks if we're talking conversions. So like direct response, because if you get 100 clicks and you don't get a single conversion, that means your conversion rate's less than 1%, which probably means it's not working too well. It's not going to work out. So that's like a good starting point. So then whatever your average CPC is, you can just, spend $100, see what your average cost per click is, take that times 100. That's your pilot budget. And that's just a starting point. You're not going to get rich off this. It's just to understand how much, how many, and then from there you can start to dive more into it. That's really specific to like campaigns that are driving to a landing page where you're trying to drive a conversion. So that could be like LinkedIn, like absent of traffic source. I'm driving to this page. I want someone to do something. That's kind of like the baseline sample that I aim for. Where it gets different is like now if we're talking about like awareness versus conversion. For awareness, for those listening, we're like, what's a good starting budget for ABM awareness? I always recommend minimum 100 impressions by account, ideally 1,000 impressions by account. And when you start to scope that out, and now you know your average CPM, you can take the difference and then you can multiply what is required to expose 100 accounts versus 1,000 and so on and so forth. Because the biggest thing people get wrong on awareness, especially for LinkedIn and ABM, is they don't have enough impressions by account. So it's like when you run the numbers, it's like I have an account list of, 100 companies, and then my budget is $100. It shakes out to like $1 per account, which is, just saying it out loud sounds ridiculous, but 96% of LinkedIn ad accounts that we audit are all falling into this mistake. Is they have way too many accounts in their list, and there's not enough budget to actually satisfy that list.
We've talked about it, but I'm going to emphasize it again. Set clear timelines and deliverables. So defining the success metrics, that's going to matter. And then really understanding what the roadmap is to get there is just as important. We talked about this, but I'm going to emphasize it again. You've got to have clear upfront timelines for both parties, or that's where it gets squirrely. Like if it's not defined up front or you're not defining it as you go, like this is what we expect from the pilot. This is what we expect from month 1, month 2. That's when things start going sideways. So be proactive in your communication, but set those clear timelines and deliverables up front. I think that's going to be super, super key.
One of the things that I, like absent of paid ads and just like being in a leadership position, one of the things that I heard that I loved and it just stuck with me is you want to manage outcomes, not tasks. And by getting really clear on like, hey, here are the goals, here are the deliverables, here are the timelines, and managing and holding your partners responsible to the outcomes and being less involved in the tasks is really key, because where I've seen it go wrong is clients will hire an agency, they'll hire a freelancer consultant, an expert to help them in a certain thing. And they get so bogged down in the tasks and managing them on the tasks where they're like fighting against the agency saying, hey, we should do it this way, we should do it that way. And they're like ignoring the advice of the person they brought on to help them with the problem because they're getting so caught up in the weeds and the minutia, versus you're better off stepping out of that, which is why you brought them on in the first place, to get you some time back, right? And to have somebody else take care of this, hold them accountable to the outcomes and let them execute the tasks in the way they best see fit, because they're the experts and they've done this countless times.
Huge, huge. I think a lot of in-house marketers, and I was one of them, it's so easy to get caught into the weeds. But again, if you're managing on those outcomes, it's like such a great way to say it. you're going to get to the results that that actually matter. So I love that. I love that. And it's like also you're not getting caught off guard with like, oh, a new thing just happened. Oh, LinkedIn allowed you to do this now. It keeps you grounded and focused on what really matters. And of course, like let your agency and your partners come to the table with new ideas, of course, but it's like it keeps you focused. And focus is the biggest thing. Like I feel like I can have a whole conversation around like, the 80-20 principle, but it's like if you literally if you get too in the weeds and you're not defining the outcomes and the timelines, you're going to get so off track so fast and you're going to be optimizing things that don't even matter.
Mic drop. I think that's a great place to end this conversation. So just to recap, the 10 tips. Tip number 1 is to be clear on your communication needs up front. Tip number 2 is to decide your meeting cadence. Tip number 3 is to get clear on the who and the what with the tools and who has to provide access. Tip number 4 was to review your brand foundations with your partners and providers. Tip number 5 is to know your targeting. Tip number 6 is to be specific on how things should be tracked. Tip number 7 is to understand your historical benchmarks. Tip number 8 is to dial in your naming conventions. Tip number 9 is to set clear, trackable goals and results. And finally, tip number 10 is to set timelines and deliverables. Brittany, thank you so much for being a part of this episode. I had a blast. We can talk forever. If people wanted to connect with you, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn /Brittany Blanken and send me a DM. Let me know what you think about it. It was awesome being a part of this. Seriously, Silvio, this was awesome.
My pleasure. We're going to link Brittany's socials down below. So definitely check her out or her website, everything like that. And if you need help with demand generation, she is the woman to call. All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care, everybody.